Good morning, LinkedIn, and thank you so much for joining us live, or if you're watching the replay, thank you so much for tuning in. Today's guest is Aoife Mollin. Now, myself and Aoife were kind of, let's say we mix in the same circles, but we didn't know each other that well. But a mutual friend introduced us because she noticed that we were both doing the same type of research, or had done the same type of research for our dissertations. My research was all based around this concept of fit and fitting in at work, something I'm hugely interested in. And it was quantitative based study, whereas Aoife was looking at something different. She was looking at job satisfaction in a remote working environment. But strangely enough, the concept of fit really came out strongly in that. So I thought it'd be a really great opportunity to get her onto the podcast. Now, the podcast came out this morning. You can get it anywhere that you listen to podcasts. So you can listen to the full episode. And I think I put a link already below this. So check out the link to the full podcast if you want to listen. If I haven't, then I will check afterwards and I will add the link there. But anyway, back to Aoife. Aoife, welcome, and thank you so much for your time today. Thank you so much for your time for being on the podcast. Do you want to tell people a little bit about yourself, and then we can start talking about fit?
Yeah, thanks, Aoife. Great name. You can easily remember both of us. But yeah, like you said, it was great that we were able to have that conversation because we both found it really interesting because of the research that we were doing. Mm-hmm. So my background, I set up AMA Results about 6 years ago, and I work mostly with leaders in organizations, middle managers, doing leadership development as well as career coaching. And they kind of link, because what I found was when I started in leadership development, a lot of people were saying, I don't know what I want in my career. I don't know, where am I going? What's next? Mm-hmm. So that career focus really comes into, leaders are kind of struggling, but one of the main struggles is actually what am I doing? What do I want? But it was interesting for us that we were both completing research, like you mentioned. So I finished my master's was positive psychology and coaching psychology. And the research that I had started on the topic that I had picked way before COVID was being talked about, way before any of this came up, was job satisfaction in a remote or a virtual work environment. And I did it specifically with a company that are set up as a virtual company. Mm-hmm. So that's their setup. It's how they work. And it just happened, like you mentioned, mine was qualitative. And that meant that I was talking to people, I was interviewing people to get their perspective, their opinions, and really take all of that from across the spectrum. So it was people from working across Europe and across the US in the company that I spoke with to get their perspective on what was their feelings around job satisfaction in that virtual work environment. So I looked at it from the perspective of what were they telling me, and then how did that compare to, there's loads of research on job satisfaction. I mean, it's not a new topic. It's been around. A lot of it is quantitative. You have a lot of scales. There is, so there is a lot out there already. But it's this, our work environment. And again, I'm talking before COVID, our work environment was slightly shifting. There was more people who wanted more flexibility, who wanted to work remotely. And it just happened that I had scheduled my interviews for March. So as I was starting my interviews, the world was going into lockdown. So even the participants were going, oh my God, you've started this because of COVID. And it's like, no, or like the mix between COVID and this, but it wasn't. So my research wasn't COVID based, because I think when we're looking at remote working, everyone who's now remote working, it's not necessarily their choice to work remotely. It's not normal remote working. It's not a normal work environment at the moment. We're in lockdown. There's a lot of people juggling a lot of things at home. So I think it's useful to remember that as well, is that actually, and I'm interested to see, what research will come out of this COVID environment, but actually the research done on remote working and job satisfaction and fit is pre-COVID, and it's kind of, it's a different situation. But like you said, so some of the results that came out of my research, we had that common of fit, which was something that came up in both, which was really, really interesting.
Absolutely. And interesting what you say about job satisfaction. That was something like, I won't say I was advised not to do it, but it was kind of like I really had to justify why I looked at job satisfaction, because so many people have done research into job satisfaction. Therefore, what am I actually adding to the conversation? But I did justify it in such a way that I was adding to research that had already been done. Looking at things from a slightly different perspective in relation to fit, and the way I modeled the data and things like that as well. But super interesting. And I kind of look back now and go, I didn't explicitly look at COVID in the research that I did, I asked the same questions that I would have asked in a non-COVID situation.
Yeah.
It probably would have overcomplicated things had I added it. I just kind of ignored it for the time being. And I did obviously mention it in my limitations of the research that, people were in this situation. So if they're talking about things like their autonomy need is probably being really satisfied because they have a greater level of autonomy because they're working from home. And interestingly, in part of my, it didn't form part of my research question as such, but in the preliminary research that I was doing, one of the areas that came up was that you can have too much or too little. So it's about finding that balance of need satisfaction, rather than, if you have too little autonomy, it means you're being micromanaged. If you have too much autonomy, it means that you have kind of a lack of guidance. You're not really sure which direction to take. You've just been left to your own devices to figure things out, but you're not really sure what you're supposed to do. And that's definitely something I would love to do a bit more research on, for sure. But there are some kind of common threads. As you mentioned, it's this concept of fit. So like, what were the key things that came out in your research?
Yeah, so like I said, I was looking at job satisfaction specifically in that virtual work environment. And I'll go through some of the things that came up and then where fit came into it as well. So some of the concepts, like we said, job satisfaction, there's loads of research out there. It's looking at the job itself, the work environment itself, what you were saying around autonomy, some of that came up in mine around responsibility and level of responsibility. Trust was a big one that came up from a virtual work environment perspective. That's really important because, like people will know now, because a lot of us are experiencing it, you're not in the office, you're not seeing people. So having that trust. So that was a big one that came up. But for the individuals who were involved in the research that I was doing, a major theme that came out was this, and it related to the individuals. So in terms of me as an individual and what I might be looking for my job satisfaction in a virtual work environment, there is things around, well, actually, what stage in life am I at? So what am I looking for and what are the really important things to me? And part of that is that, and there has already been some research done around the person-organizational fit of how does this organization fit with what I need at the moment? And part of that is around what I need from a work perspective, but also what I need from a personal perspective. We talk about company values and stuff like that as well. People look at that now, and I know when I'm doing my career coaching, it comes in more. People are like, oh, I want a job that I'm interested in, but the culture is really important. So culture was another topic that came up as well. From the person organizational fit perspective, you had some people, God, I should probably go back and look at some of the quotes, but, I remember they were saying like, oh, it felt right, really right for me. And, I really loved the way I do have flexibility in how I'm working. And some of that flexibility is flexibility in terms of location. Some of that flexibility is flexibility in terms of time. But also from some of the people that I talked to, they also noted, so some of the people who were in managerial roles, we have had people who have joined the organization who have went, this is not for me. There isn't a right fit here. And some of the stuff that came out was quotes around, it needs to fit a certain type of person. So a certain type of person works well. And I'd say if there's anyone listening to this who at the moment is, we're all been forced to work from home. It's not a choice at the moment. And they're going, oh my God, I'd love to get back into the office. Whereas you have, even before COVID, there are more virtual companies coming up. There are more people who are looking for that flexibility, who want remote working, and recognizing that this is what works really well for me. So it is a really individual thing. And I think companies have got to recognize that, as well as individuals, of actually, how does this work for me in terms of, if job satisfaction is something that's important to me, if I really do want to make sure I have that fit with the company, well, what do I look for? And it's part of that, knowing what's important to you and making sure that that fits with what's important to the company as well, and that there are those links there.
Yeah, so you bring some really interesting points there around flexibility in particular, just like that there's different types of flexibility. I know in the preliminary research I was doing, they looked at this concept of, academic term temporal flexibility, meaning you can choose your own working hours essentially. And that's mostly what people talk about when they talk about flexible working, in my view, but you're talking about kind of location flexibility and other types of flexibility to offer people. Interesting as well about the needs. So need satisfaction formed a crucial part of the research that I did. And I looked specifically at our universal basic needs of autonomy, relatedness, and competence. If anyone is interested in that, happy to share the more details about the research that I did. But so they're universal, they're basic. They may change in the degree of how much you need of those things. So maybe in the start of your career you need less autonomy, but as your career progresses, your need for autonomy increases. You need more and more autonomy as you progress through your career. But interesting that our needs sort of change depending on the point in time. Whereas when we're talking about things like values and our own values, that formed another crucial part of the research that I did. The values piece is something that doesn't really change over time, and it's so interesting that maybe the needs might change, and your strengths, I think your inherent strengths tend to stay the same, whereas but you can build on those strengths as well. So that's kind of the third element that I got.
Yeah, and I think recognizing those changing needs, because there was definitely, again, at that, point in time in life, and that was something that was interesting. That was a quote that came up from more than one participant in the research that I was doing, that there was, this was just the perfect time. I couldn't commute anymore. The 3-hour commute that I was doing in my previous role to this, changing from that to this was what I really needed. So recognizing how their needs had changed and what really suited them. And even down to, because I know people will generalize and go, oh, well, extroverts probably are really missing the social contact right now. And, in remote working, that's something that, but I don't think it's as simple as, introverts are absolutely fine working remotely and it's all okay. And extroverts, oh God, they'd really struggle. Because actually in the research that I did, that personality, that individuality was coming out, but there was extroverts who were really happy in that remote environment, and they still felt like they could build up the relationships. They still felt like they had the interaction. They still felt like they had enough. And again, it was kind of how the communication, how the culture in that company, how they were all set up, that for an extrovert or an introvert, it could work really well for both. Yeah. So I would be really interested to see now, is there future research that comes out with kind of with COVID and with so much more remote working, how some of that changes, or what that says.
It would be so interesting to see additional research now that people are kind of forced into the situation. They don't necessarily have a choice, but it's interesting that we might kind of make a sweeping statement saying, no, it's all fine for introverts because they don't want to be in the office and they can work from home. I'm an introvert. And while I do like that alone time and I do like being on my own, I definitely see the benefits of being in an office environment. So like if I went to a co-working space, for example, it would be a huge difference. Just that interaction with other people. It does really make a difference. So it's interesting, I think, for each individual, they need to take responsibility for themselves and understanding what is it that I'm looking for. And like you say, so if you need more of that social interaction, then build that into your day,
Exactly. Yeah. And back again to organization fit, the purpose or the person organization fit. It's also, what does the organization need from me? Because potentially in my role or whatever way, we work as an organization, there potentially does need to be different ways of interacting and different ways of kind of how we communicate and the culture that we build up. And again, in that culture piece, trust was a massive thing that came up in a virtual work environment. You've got to have that trust there. You've got to trust, or you've got to work on that as part of the setup and how we work and all of that.
Yeah, no, trust. I think it's a really interesting concept in general. It did come up. It's not something I included in the research, but it did come up in some of the articles and the journal articles that I read in advance. Yeah. Sorry. And I'm kind of sorry now that I didn't include that, but it was the model that I used was quite complicated as it was, so maybe it wasn't the additional.
Yeah, I say anyone who's done research, or both of us understand, it's like you could go. There's so much you could, but then you're stuck at a time and also word count and all the. So it's like, okay, I need to narrow in.
I was quite naive going into it, thinking I could do everything. I would a whole load of questions and see what relates to what, and it's like you can't do that. You have to start with a hypothesis, and I should have known that from my research background. But this concept of trust, just kind of coming back to that, I know one of the things we're saying, like, and this came up, like one of my really popular articles, or not articles, but posts on LinkedIn in 2020 was this, like, and so much debate about it. How do I know that people are working? If people are working from home, how do I actually know? How can I tell? And like the simple answer is you can't. You have to trust that people get stuff done. And it's shift to outcome based. Like it doesn't matter how much time people spend doing their work. If they're working on the wrong things, if they're working on things that are not driving the business forward, then that was a complete waste of time. You need to have real focus on what it is that what kind of outcomes, and that can be, you can be doing admin and stuff that contributes to those outcomes, but like it's about focusing, being really clear on what that vision is for the business and focusing on those outcomes. And
and when you set the clear expectations, that was definitely something that came up in terms of link to the trust. And with the company that I worked with, definitely, they were set up as a remote company. They had all the structures in place and everything was, kind of set up of this is how we're going to work. They constantly look at their processes and update things like that. They don't have any of this software that checks, how people are working or how much people are working. They actually looked into that at one stage and went, no, it's not a good investment and it's not part of our culture. It's not what we want, because we want people to trust people. And it's a, simple case of how do I know if people are working? Well, have you set the expectation of what's expected from them, what outcomes they're expected to deliver, and also the expectation of if they're struggling and if anything isn't working, that they'll come back to you. So that communication piece in terms of, and this came up from a job satisfaction perspective, but really within the culture of how this company was set up, of communication was really important, because people felt like, oh, well, if you have an issue, you just go and talk to somebody. You just, you ping them, you call them, you arrange a call. You do a video call with them. It's like, I know the support is there. I know if I have an issue, I go talk to someone. I know if I can't do something or if something's come up, I go talk to someone. I know if I'm having tech problems and my, literally my internet goes down, or someone said they had electricity, like everything literally shut off, and they were like, I can't work for the next 4 hours. They have a process for that. So it's like, but I know what to do. I contact this person by phone and say, look, and at the time, I remember she said, she was supposed to be, and it was kind of work where she needed to be kind of on call. So it was like, I should be a point of contact. So she contacted the person to say, I'm not going to be available. And their process kicks into place. Also, they did have, that question of how you know if people are working, said, we've probably have some people who've gotten away with not doing as much work as they should have, but you kind of get found out over time. You get found out. And if you are, exactly, and you will notice that. So if you're a manager now who's sitting there worrying about your, are my team working enough? I would turn it around and go, have you set the expectations? Are you being clear on what's expected of them, the outcomes they're expected to deliver, the support that's available to them? And are you checking in at the right points that, they are kind of, and not micromanaging, but that they know support is there, but they're also clear on what they are taking responsibility for to deliver as part of their job role. So sometimes rather than sitting there worrying, actually turn around and do something about it. Make sure there is that clarity of communication, clarity of expectations, and then trust them to do it and get it done. And if they don't, then deal with it.
Like builds that element of psychological safety, so that people can feel free to, like, if they're not coping very well, that there is someone that they can speak to about it, that they feel
exactly
safe. And I think oftentimes that comes from the leadership being vulnerable and letting other people know, actually, I'm not coping very well.
And talking to people at the moment.
I'm just conscious of time here, Aoife.
Sorry, we could probably
all day between the two of us. It's such an interesting topic. But as I mentioned at the start of the live, the podcast is available now wherever you listen to podcasts. There should be a link below. If there's not, I will add one now so you can listen to the podcast in its entirety. Some really, really interesting insights shared from Aoife. And if you want to know more about fitting in at work from the quantitative perspective, if you're interested in research or anything like that, do feel free to reach out to me. Any parting words, Aoife, before we sign off?
No, I think it was great to chat. If people have any questions from the podcast, just come back to us. We'll happily talk more.
Talk more about fitting in at work. Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for tuning in today. And let me know